Hello. The topic of this lecture is the demandingness objection to utilitarianism. Uh, it's at this point in the course where we're taking a look at some of the troubles with utilitarianism, and again, the purpose of going through those troubles is not to create the impression that utilitarianism is somehow a bad view. In fact, it gets all of this criticism, and we spend so much time talking about it because it's a rather good view, and in spite of having some very serious problems, also has some fairly compelling responses to those objections. So the reading attached to this particular objection comes from a man named Peter Singer. He's still working. He's the emeritus Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University. He's been at Princeton for quite some time now. He wrote the article in question, an article called Famine, Affluence, and Morality in 1971. It's one of the more important things anybody's written about ethics in the last century at least. Um, and it goes along with a pretty prominent career. If you're interested, some of the other works that Singer is justifiably famous for includes a book called Animal Liberation, which is very foundational to the animal rights movement in the Western world. A book called The Expanding Circle, which has some very interesting things to be said about moral progress and the rights revolutions that typify it. And also The Life You Can Save, which goes over a lot of the territory that is gone over in Famine, Affluence, and Morality as well. So Singer himself, I think it's worth noting that he's easily the most famous contemporary utilitarian moral philosopher that there is, easily. Um, and so you might say, okay, why are we reading, something from a utilitarian to give us this major objection to utilitarianism? And well, that's one of those things where oftentimes in philosophy, the most effective critic of a particular view is somebody who actually has that view. And this should be somewhat natural in the sense that a person who actually has worked out a detailed view uh, knows more about it than somebody who hasn't spent as much time thinking about that view, and so they know its weaknesses as well as its strengths. And the status of philosophy as a critical field tends to reward people for pointing out the flaws in their own views. Now, again, despite the fact that utilitarianism does have this demandingness problem, Singer doesn't write the article with the intent to describe the problem that utilitarianism has. He writes an article that expresses what he thinks is just a basic moral view, and we'll see how basic the moral view is here in just a moment. But when you read it over, when you read Famine, Affluence, and Morality, you will absolutely see where the demandingness objection is coming out of it. So first, let's talk about the one of the three words in the title: famine, affluence, and morality. We'll of course also talk about affluence and morality, but let's start with famine. Um, and I think it's just worth mentioning a couple of things before we start. Singer himself, as you see in the article, mentions that his inspiration is a particular famine that occurred in the early 1970s, and he was moved to think about the broader issue of an unequal world, right? A world in which some people have far more than they need, and other people suffer and die from various types of deprivations. And I should say that famine is certainly not the only source of extensive human misery in the world, and that's the last point on this here. But I do want to say a few things about famine because I think it's something that is commonly misunderstood, and times have changed, and the world has changed. In a rather dramatic way since the early 1970s when Peter Singer wrote this piece. So the first thing to note is in my first bullet point here that the number and severity of famines has seen really significant decline since the 1960s. And if you look at the sort of the bar graph over on the right over here, you see the text is really, really small. This is sort of broken out by decade, going all the way back to around the 1850s, right? And so you get to, or I think 1860s, and so I believe this huge bar here is the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and then sort of you get into the 20th century, the aughts, the 10s, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. This is the 1960s, and this is 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010 to 16, which is when this which is when the data set that they're using to make the graph goes to. This comes from a really wonderful website called Our World in Data, which is sort of unparalleled in their sort of visual data journalism. I'd highly recommend that for really any research on any complex topic. But one of the things you do notice when you look at this chart is two things. On the left is the number of deaths, right? And you're talking in the high parts, you're talking the sort of tens of millions of people dying of famine, and in modern times more like in the hundreds of thousands, which is a lot of people. But when you consider the entire world's population, which is on the right hand side of the graph, you see the population has continued to go up and up and up at a higher rate. That's a very familiar growth curve in that sort of 20th century population explosion. And so this chart upsets one of the first misunderstandings that people do tend to have about famine, and it's that famine is caused by overpopulation. Well, if that were true, then we'd see more and more famine as the population really explodes instead of less and less, because along with that population explosion has also come just a great deal more wealth in the world than there used to be, and so more people are more financially secure than ever have been before. And that's a kind of good news, right? I mean, that's we should want more prosperity to spread all over the globe, and it in fact has, but. And again, it's good news that the number of deaths from famine has gotten so low as it is compared with many sort of past eras. But think about what this means morally, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, well, gosh, there are something like 30 million people who were needing assistance. And that's a huge number that requires a tremendous amount of resources, and a problem that size might seem insolvable. But now we're talking about just a few 100,000 people, right? Which is not even a large town in just about any country in the world. That's and if that's all it takes, right, to sort of eradicate famine, it seems like again, compared to the resources that are available in the world today, that's really paltry. And so the fact that it's still there seems actually more morally objectionable rather than less. And so the size of the problem here is really quite manageable. And so in fact, the other misunderstanding that people often have about famines is that they and this is an understandable misunderstanding as those things go, but it's commonly thought that famines are caused by a lack of available food, right? You say, well, look, there just isn't enough food somewhere, maybe due to a war or a drought or something like that. And very often, right, those kinds of events can trigger famines, but if you just look at the world as a whole, basically every area of the world, every continent, sort of region that's listed here, this is the calories per person from 1961 to 2021. And so I've highlighted 2021 here, the most recent year in this particular data set, and you're looking at an average per person available food of 2,500 to 3,500 calories per. I mean, recommended diets are like somewhere around 2,000 calories, right, per person, right? And so again, there's plenty of food in the world, Okay, and there's no sign of there not being enough available food, and that's just not the way the modern world works. Transportation is more than good enough to get the food from one place to another in any sort of timely fashion. Communication is more than good enough to learn of conditions where famines might be happening. Where famines do happen in the modern world, it's not from a lack of available food. Certainly, many famines in the ancient world were caused in that manner, but in the modern world, if there's a famine somewhere, it's a problem with food distribution. It's usually a form of political injustice. And so, again, famine is just one example of the kind of thing that's going to motivate Singer, but you should keep in mind that there are plenty of other things that cause all kinds of untold misery all over the world, and that just even a fairly small amount of resources could honestly make a huge difference. And it was true in Singer's day, and it's even more true now. So let's take a look now at Singer's actual argument. He starts off with the really uncontroversial presence here that suffering and death are bad. And in fact, he says it's sort of so uncontroversial that he doesn't really bother to defend this claim. He just says, "Look, if you don't think this is true, I really can't say anything to you. You can just stop reading now. There's no, and to an extent, that's I think an understandable position to take. If you don't think that suffering and death are bad, really, there's not much I can say to you either." So let's proceed as if this premise is really unproblematic because it is unproblematic. Okay, so now the second premise just says this. It says, if you can prevent something bad without sacrificing something of comparable moral value, then you are morally required to do so. And when you think about this, it seems like the most basic of all possible observations about morality. If morality in any way depends on the consequences, then it seems like when you have two options, one of which has better consequences than the other thing, you should do the thing with the better consequences. No, that's really all that this premise is saying to us. Right? It's saying that if you can do something, right, that's going to, again, prevent a whole lot of pain and suffering, and it's not going to really cost you anything all that significant, well, other things being equal, morality requires you to do that. And again, it seems so very basically sensible. And the only reason you might disagree with this claim is if you're reasoning out its implications and wish to resist them. So he continues on the argument and just points out, just a matter of fact in this case, premise 2 is a statement of value, right? That's where most of our discussion is going to be, is about that principle. Premise 3 is just a statement of fact. Singer claims that you can prevent suffering and death by sacrificing luxuries, that is, things that are nice, but that you don't need. That's the definition of a luxury, is something that is nice to have, but that is not required, right? You don't have to have it. Right, so anything that fits into that category is a luxury by this definition. That's typically how we define the term and use it. And so he says you can prevent suffering and death by sacrificing luxuries to give to aid and relief efforts. And again, that's uncontroversially true. If you decided not to purchase the most recent cell phone release, which could cost something like $800, $1,000, $1,200, something like that, you decided, I could keep the phone I have for several more years with no trouble to me. Instead, I'll take that $1,000 and send it to Oxfam, right? Well, you will have prevented suffering and death, and without really doing anything terrible to yourself. And so again, that's a thing we absolutely can do. And so when you look at these three premises and just sort of imagine what comes next, you don't really even have to see it. It's a valid argument here. The conclusion, if you accept those claims, is that you are morally required to sacrifice luxuries to give to aid and relief efforts. Simply because sacrificing the luxury has better consequences. I mean, and look, no matter how cool the newest phone is, or a pair of designer jeans, or name your thing. I'm sure that you can even think of better things than is even on that list that they cost a lot and maybe they're fun to have. But no matter how cool that new phone is it giving you as much pleasure as it would be saving as compared with the pain it would save when buying life-saving medicines that really only cost a few dollars per dose, right? For huge swaths of people, or providing enough calories to live, right, in some temporary disaster situation for some dozens or even hundreds of people for some period of time. I mean, like I can't imagine what it must be like to starve to death, but I can only imagine it could. It's among the very worst experience. I hope never to experience it, and I hope nobody does. But of course, we know that they do. And so when you weigh that kind of pain and suffering against, I mean, again, even if the phone's real cool, it's a pretty paltry comparison. And so what Singer's done here is he's given us a very, very basic argument that makes a very commonsensical observation about morality. And yet, if we in fact followed Singer's argument here, the world would be immeasurably transformed. We fall in actual practice quite short of even this argument. So academically here, let's consider some of the features of Singer's argument. Here are some of the things to notice about the way that he argues this particular point. First off, he is arguing that what makes something right or wrong is what happens when you do it. Right? The entire part of the reasoning is about the consequences. Right? So where should you put your resources? Well, it seems like morality requires you to put those resources wherever they cause the most good, or at least relieve the most pain, or something like that. And so again, this is a consequentialist viewpoint, very, very straightforwardly. The consequences that he states are in terms of pleasures from luxuries on the one hand, and pains from starvation and sickness, displacement from one's home, et cetera, et cetera. All those sorts of things that we know people suffer from all over the world. Those are pains. And so it seems, again, very straightforwardly, like his argument is not just in the consequentialist line, but takes hedonism as as the thing it focuses on, pleasures and pains, that is. And the argument, notice, does actually stop short of full optimificity. Notice that in that second premise, Singer says not you should you should put all of your resources where they will do the most good. That is, you should give until giving will actually hurt you more than it doesn't. Right? It stops short of that. It just says, look, if you can sacrifice a luxury, right, to prevent some kind of more massive suffering and death, and more massive suffering, then you should. Right? It doesn't say that you have to give to what's called the point of marginal utility. He might in fact believe that's your moral obligation, but notice he's presented the argument he's presented is sort of utilitarianism light, and not even full blown optimificity, and yet it's still tremendously demanding. And so you might say, there might be a lot of things, sort of, there's a lot of ways that you might try and resist Singer's argument, or you might say something like, well, look, if his argument is so compelling and so basic, and it should be so obvious, why does basically nobody do it? And Singer, of course, addresses this question, and there are a number of things that people might say are ways of justifying, morally speaking, they're not sacrificing all kinds of luxuries in order to prevent massive amounts of suffering and death. But for the most part, these aren't very good. They can maybe explain why people don't follow this kind of moral this sort of a moral argument, but it doesn't really justify their not doing so, as you'll see. And so let's go through them fairly briefly. I don't want to just step on the article and sort of rehash it in every detail, but I do want to highlight at least some of these things. So, I mean, one of these might say, well, look, it's hard. A lot of times, a lot of times the people who are suffering the most are strangers that are far away from us, right? Well, look, when suffering is much nearer, people don't behave all that much better all the time, Sometimes they do, but not always. And of course, is that morally relevant? And this is where the impartiality of utilitarianism really comes to the fore. Is it really important that these people are strangers and that they live far away? Does that make their pleasures and pains matter less? That they're there, right? A very little amount of searching will be able to find people who are suffering and who are in trouble, who are having a really bad time, where even a very small amount of resources would make a huge amount of difference. That's just not difficult to find, and we all know it. And so, again, the notion that they're far away matters even less now than it did in 1970 because, of course, again, modern communication, the way that information can travel, the distance is less and less relevant. It's less and less obvious. It never was relevant. All right, so then there's this, right? So he says, well, look, maybe part of the reason why people aren't as generous as they should be is that they see others, they behave as other people do, right? That if they don't see most people around them being particularly generous, that is foregoing a lot of luxuries in order to alleviate suffering, well, they'll just sort of act the same way. And again, psychologically, that may be true. That may, in fact, be a way that people behave, and probably is, right? There's probably a lot of that where people will kind of behave more or less like the people around them are behaving. But of course, is that a justification, right? Just because nobody else is doing their moral duty, does that mean that you shouldn't? Right? Again, you might be able to explain why you're not, but it doesn't seem like that can really justify the not following what appears to be, again, a pretty basic observation about morality, is that when the difference between the amount of suffering you could alleviate and the amount of pleasure you could cause by spending a certain amount of money it's so starkly different, you should maybe consider alleviating the suffering instead of just buying a luxury good. And of course, we know that it's a big world, and that there are certain kind of problems that to some extent we've always dealt with, and it seems like global poverty or global hunger or global economic inequality are problems that are so big that what's my little contribution going to mean in the long run? And so people can feel powerless in a lot of ways. And again, this psychologically might explain why people are less willing to do what it seems that morality demands of them. But that's a mere explanation once again. Just because you feel powerless doesn't mean you in fact are. And there's a sense in which we know we're not entirely powerless. Can you all by yourself solve world hunger? No. But could you keep some number of people from starving to death if you put your resources in the right place? Yes. Yes. You certainly could. And of course, since the time that Singer wrote this piece, a lot of the major problems that he's thinking about, including, for example, famine, have gotten much better than they were even his day. And so we have even less reason to think of these problems as insolvable or intractable or things that we can't do anything about, because we certainly can. In fact, it's even easier now than it used to be. Another argument that he mentions that I think is really clever, right, is that he says, well, look, imagine this. So imagine somebody says, all right, we could solve world hunger if everybody in the world gave $5 or something, some equivalent of that. And so if that's true, then really all I owe to the cause is $5. right? Because that's my fair share of addressing the problem. So once I've given my $5, I can, morally speaking, be completely satisfied. And Singer's response to this is pretty interesting. He says, "Okay, look, that would be true if everybody was giving, but you know that they're not." And so you still have this problem where it's like, even after you've given your $5, if you know that almost nobody else is giving anything, you still have this choice of whether to cause a bit of pleasure for yourself or some people close to you, or alleviate a whole heck of a lot of suffering from those who may not, or may not be very far away from you. And it's you still face that choice. And again, morality seems to be fairly clear on the balance of trying to prevent the more massive amount of suffering instead of choosing the more meager amount of pleasure. And then finally, you might say, okay, well, look, just throwing money at a problem doesn't fix it, right? There's all kinds of other things that we really have to do to solve all of the world's problems, right? Well, number one, if you think that throwing money at a problem won't fix it, just try it sometime. I mean, it's not 100%, but like it's pretty good. Like most of the things in this world that we throw a whole lot of money at tend to get pretty good. So that's just an observation. But of course, again, Singer's reply to this concern is also on point. Um, if you think, for example, that it's political reform that the world needs, right? That if we sort of improve people's political systems, right, making them more responsive, making them more democratic, making them less corrupt, et cetera, those sorts of things. If you think that's really the way to, in the long run, alleviate the most suffering, well, then do that, or give to causes that are furthering that, right? You don't necessarily have to just give to direct aid or something like that. Um, so again, Singer's point is, look, if direct aid isn't the most effective thing, if you think it's not the most effective thing, that doesn't alleviate your obligation to do something. It just changes what it is you're supposed to do, what it is you think that actually will have the best impact. And then finally, sometimes people will just say, well, look, people just don't care enough about other people to act this way. And again, I'm not sure that's entirely true, but even if it is, that doesn't change our moral obligations, right? I mean, just because people don't, in fact, or may not, in fact, care all that much about other people, doesn't mean they shouldn't. And so again, Singer's reply here is fairly easy. So again, once you add all these up, you get a lot of ways that you might explain why people don't do as this very simple argument seems to suggest they ought to. But there's not really any strong reason for doubting the argument, doubting that we really do have a large degree of unmet moral obligation. And so this then at last brings us to the demandingness objection. So and by this point, I think you can probably see how demanding utilitarianism really is. Even Singer's argument, which is utilitarianism light, again, imagine like how radically it would change the world if even a fraction of the world's people actually followed it. Right? Even if just 1 in 10 people decided to give up one out of every 5 luxury goods that they purchase in favor of, sending those resources to where they will actually do more good, again, the world would be unimaginably changed. And so, I mean, if you feel sort of bad at this point, I think that's pretty natural, and I think that's look, I don't think that Singer wanted you to feel bad, but I think he certainly did want to sort of open people's eyes as to their unmet moral obligations. And so one of the ways you can that people have dealt with this is by saying, well, okay, maybe this kind of demandingness illustrates some kind of a problem with utilitarianism. Maybe utilitarianism is just too demanding. And again, if you can't see that, I mean, by now, I don't know what to say, right? And yeah, it's absolutely true that utilitarianism does hold us to a very high moral standard. But I want to stress that all by itself, that's not a bad problem. Okay, I mean, so again, imagine this dialogue where say, "I don't like your theory, Mr. or Ms. Utilitarian. It would make us all be too morally good, right?" And it's like, imagine how unimpressed, right, the utilitarian should be with that line of reasoning. They're like, so your complaint is that my theory of morality, my theory of how to be good, says that you should be too good, right? Um, yeah, it's not it's again shouldn't have that much force. So really, the demandingness objection has to take some other kind of tack, and I think the best way of explaining it, in my view, is as follows. Um, that it is also true that utilitarianism, sort of in making the optimific action the only morally acceptable action all the time, um, means that there would be no supererogatory actions, right? So this is I've highlighted the word here. So this is a word that's you can use it to impress your friends at lunch or whatever. It's a word that ethicists use to talk about words that are good, right? Or sorry, not words, actions, right? Supererogatory actions are actions that are good, but that go beyond what is morally required, right? So the things that are above and beyond the call of moral duty, as it were. And that's actually usually the way that people think of something like charity, right? They think that it's good to give away resources, but it's not required, right? Morally speaking, and that's a very traditional way of thinking about it. Maybe that's mistaken, right? But it does seem as if morality should have some room for things that are supererogatory. That's a common idea that we really do have. Now, when one of our common ideas conflicts with an otherwise good moral theory, we should pause and think. We should think to ourselves, okay, well, does do the fact is the fact that we think that there ought to be supererogatory actions, and utilitarianism doesn't really have any room for those. Um, is that a problem with utilitarianism, or is it a problem with this common idea that we have? Is utilitarianism good enough, right? And again, there are a lot of things about utilitarianism that make a whole lot of sense, and so it might be that the right thing to do here is to rethink whether morality really should include actions that are supererogatory or not. But at the very least, this is a place where the dispute is much more reasonable than just saying, "Oh no, utilitarianism would make us be too good," right? Well, let us revisit for a second Mill's reply, if you'll recall from the second chapter of his book Utilitarianism. And this is how Mill replied to people in his own day that had made the same sort of accusation that maybe utilitarianism's demands are too extreme, right? That you should have to redo or rejigger the moral theory a little bit in order to tamp down some of that demandingness. Okay. And so, again, recall that Mill wrote this. He says, look, according to the utilitarian ethics, the object of virtue, again, means like personal character, moral behavior, right, is to multiply happiness. For any person except one in 1,000, it's only on exceptional occasions that he has it in his power to do this on an extended scale, i.e., to be a public benefactor. And it is only on these occasions that he is called upon to consider public utility. In every other case, he needs attend only to private utility, the interest of happiness of some few persons. Right? And I mean, again, it seems not unreasonable, but when you put it in the context of Singer's article and what Singer has written, and if you look at Singer's argument here, especially when you think about the way that the modern world is, it starts to this really doesn't look like all that strong of a reply, because after all, it's not just one person in 1,000, especially these days, that has the power to have some real impact, even if a small one, right? But a very real impact nonetheless on the happiness of many people. That's within all of our power, almost all the time. Even if we don't think of ourselves as especially wealthy, I mean, surely we all have at least some resources that we don't always use to their maximum benefit, or really in some cases anywhere close. So it's I don't know, this kind of a this Mill's reply really just doesn't it looks very uncompelling in the context of Singer's observation here. And so, what might you ask, does Singer himself say about this? And unfortunately, we don't get a very extended view of Singer's about the issue of supererogation or the demandingness objection in particular. So here's what Singer has to say on supererogation. He writes, and this is a quote from the article that you may have noticed. I am not maintaining that there are no actions which are charitable, right? And when he says charitable here, he means it's in the supererogatory sense, right? He says, I'm not maintaining that there are no acts which are charitable, or that there are no acts which it would be good to do but not wrong not to do. It may be possible to redraw the distinction between duty and charity in some other place. All I am arguing here is that the present way of drawing the distinction, which makes it an act of charity for a man living at the level of affluence which most people in the quotes developed nations enjoy, to give money to save someone else from starvation, cannot be supported. It is beyond the scope of my argument to consider whether the distinction should be withdrawn or abolished altogether. There would be many other possible ways of drawing the distinction. For instance, one might decide that it is good to make other people happy as possible, but not wrong not to do so. Right, and so this is there's a lot in here to unpack. But the first thing that he points out is that that in terms of defending utilitarianism as a broad moral theory against the problem of demandingness, if you think that the problem of demandingness is largely about supererogation, he's like, look, that's not really my job here in this one article, right? I'm really just trying to convince people of one thing here, and in fact, I'm trying to convince them even of less than I think is true, right? So I think it's fair, right? It's fair for him not necessarily to take on the task of defending, utilitarianism from this demandingness objection in this particular article, because he says, look, whatever you think about utilitarianism, like the full-on utilitarianism, he's like, all I'm giving you is utilitarianism light. Right. And he says, look, all I'm arguing here is that our present way of drawing this distinction between what's beyond the call of moral duty and what isn't is messed up. Right. He says, look, if you look in the world, people who live in more affluent countries, again, even if you don't think of yourself as affluent, there are a lot of people in the world who are much, much worse off. And he says, what we normally think of as just sort of charitable, as in supererogatory, as beyond the call of duty. He says we've put that line in the wrong place, right? Now, of course, I think if you take the utilitarian moral theory to its logical extent, there is no place for supererogation. Like everything that would have better consequences, whatever has the best overall consequences, is in fact what you're morally required to do. And so again, according to the strictest version of the theory, there just isn't any room for supererogation. Maybe that's a problem. Maybe it isn't. But I think Singer's point should be well taken. That he says that at the very least, we count too much as beyond the call of moral duty that we shouldn't count as beyond the call of moral duty. I suspect that he does think there probably is no actual supererogation. That he probably does actually think that when push comes to shove, the full utilitarian picture is probably the right one. But in this particular article, he's developing and defending a really modest version, and yet, again, you should notice even the modest version really kind of pokes us in the nose and points out just how far below even a fairly minimal ethical standard we all tend to fall. So It's a powerful piece, and it's a piece that you should certainly reflect on. And again, keep in mind that morality and ethics, it's not a purely academic thing, right? It's about the world that we live in, and our place in it. And I think that perspective is one that makes this a very important piece indeed.